Learned as a teenager that if you want to survive, you have to master the tools of the Maoist toolkit. You have to be better than anybody else.
Chinese President Xi Jinping reportedly called President-elect Donald Trump to congratulate him.
Trump naming more China hawks to his cabinet.
He said that he intends to impose tariffs on products imported from China by as much as 60%.
At a pivotal moment, correspondent Martin Smith examines the rise of the Chinese leader. His life.
Xi Jinping learned as a teenager that if you want to survive, you have to master the tools of the Maoist toolkit. You have to be better than anybody else.
His rule.
She was not afraid to say, no, we're not giving you the freedoms and rights you deserve.
And relations with the United States.
We can't continue to allow China to rape our country.
Will Donald Trump, who preaches America first, go to war to defend Taiwan?
I'm not sure.
Now on front line, China, the U.S., and the rise of Xi Jinping.
This program contains graphic content which may not be suitable for all audiences. Viewer discretion is advised.
July of 2021, China marked the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party.
中国共产党一经诞生，就把为中国人民谋幸福、为中华民族谋复兴确立为自己的。
In his speech, President Xi Jinping celebrated China's emergence as one of the wealthiest countries on earth.
这是中华民族的伟大光荣，这是中国人民的伟大光荣。
By all accounts, Xi is the most powerful Chinese leader since the founder of the People's Republic, Mao Zedong. And like Mao, he has immense ambitions for his country. In his first decade in power, Xi launched the largest infrastructure project in history, building ports, roads, and a massive digital network linking China to around 150 countries. He has made China the world's #1 producer of electric vehicles. He has invested heavily in a race with the U.S. to dominate the development of artificial intelligence. He has plans to dethrone the dollar as the world's reserve currency. And Xi has presided over an increasingly antagonistic relationship with the U.S.
中国人民也绝不允许任何外来势力欺负、压迫、奴役我们。谁妄想这样干，必将在14多亿中国人民用血肉铸成的钢铁长城面前碰得头破血流。
Xi Jinping is different. He does not want to be part of the world as it is. What he wants is to be much more dominant in the way the world is run. He doesn't want...
Orville Schell is widely recognized as the dean of China experts in the U.S. and has served as a consultant on this project. He has made many trips to China and has closely observed the rise of Xi Jinping.
You can read his speeches, and it's all there. He says what he's going to do, and he does it.
台独是历史逆流，是觉悟。我们不承诺放弃使用武力。
And we can't quite believe it's anything but propaganda, which is just maybe nonsense, but it isn't. He's laid it all out there.
提高军事训练实战化水平，牢牢掌握能打仗、打胜仗的过硬本领。
Xi Jinping speaks all the time about hostile foreign forces, 敌对势力. That is the core of his sense of the U.S. and China relationship. It's hostile.
We set out to understand the roots of this hostility, to understand Xi himself and the China he is leading. But China has heavily restricted international media, and we were not allowed to report from inside the country. No current official would speak to us on the record. China is not allowing us to come into China. Why?
China's handling all kinds of challenges in the world. You may or may not be on their radar screen.
Victor Gao is a well-known figure who travels the world speaking in defense of Xi's China. We interviewed him in New York. What is it about Xi Jinping's presidency that has fomented this hostility between the U.S. and China?
I disagree with the way you characterize the situation.
After 2012, when he comes into power?
I would say fundamentally, China and the United States need to deal with each other as equals. But China-US relations are moving in a direction which is proving to be difficult and dangerous.
To begin, I wanted to know where Xi Jinping came from and how his past shaped him into the man he is today. He grew up during a tortured time in Chinese history, but he was a child of privilege with red roots. Xi's father had fought alongside Mao Zedong, and after the revolution, had risen to become a high-ranking Communist Party official. Young Xi lived in a comfortable home and was able to attend the best schools.
He was one of the so-called princelings, and there was a lot of privilege that he enjoyed. So Xi Jinping would have grown up.
Joseph Turigian is an author and professor at American University.
He went to a school that was primarily attended by the offspring of high-ranking cadres, and they were told that they were going to be the ones who were going to bring China to modernity, who were going to draw upon the legacies of the Chinese Communist Party to transform society.
Prior to the 1949 revolution, China was ruled by a US-backed dictator, Chiang Kai-shek.
Well known to every American, his lean, keen Chiang Kai-shek, undisputed leader and idol of millions of Chinese.
Mao called Chiang a running dog of imperialism. He fought to depose Chiang for 22 years.
Despite aid from America, Chiang's forces were beaten back. The revolution was now within Mao's grasp, and it was the start of the biggest political and economic experiment the world has ever seen.
Before Mao's victory, China was among the world's poorest nations. Inspired by communist theory, Mao blamed China's wealthy elites for the nation's ills. Mao embraced communist propaganda like this film to rally the people against landowners. Dunce caps, a regular feature of Mao's China, were used to publicly humiliate landowners, intellectuals, and disloyal politicians. In 1962, when Xi Jinping was just 9 years old, his father became an unlikely victim of these purges. Mao accused him of being disloyal. Xi's father was subjected to so-called struggle sessions, where he was beaten and denounced.
His father was framed by trauma charge that he supported in Norway and have cast out on Mao's leadership. And that's simple.
Professor Alfred Chan is author of an exhaustive biography of Xi Jinping that chronicles his life.
His father was dragged out and parade in the street. In those days, they put a dunce cap on him. He was subjected to mock trials. Those were essentially kangaroo courts.
Here, a sign hangs around the neck of Xi's father that reads, Anti-Party Element, Xi Zhongxun.
We know that this was an emotionally traumatizing experience for him. When you're a member of the Chinese Communist Party, everything is the party. Your entire life is the party. So for the party to tell you that you oppose Mao, it's hard to overestimate just how galling it is for a member of this kind of organization to hear that.
Xi's father was sent to work in a factory and was later incarcerated for 8 years.
Yeah, welcome in, guys. Thanks for the like.
Meanwhile, some of the party elite were having doubts about Mao's leadership. A famine, the result of Mao's failed foreign policies, had devastated the country.
These people have come with reports of people dying in the fields, starving peasants eating some of the seeds for next year's planting.
Undeterred, Mao launched his so-called Cultural Revolution in 1966, expanding the categories of those who would be purged.
So during the Cultural Revolution, there was something known as the Heilei, the black categories. And these were the people who had no standing as human beings. They had no rights. They were considered unacceptable. Or, I guess you'd have to say, evil. They had to be overturned and even possibly, in ultimate cases, exterminated. And we saw millions killed. They were not fully human.
Marauding bands of youth, known as Red Guards, were encouraged by Mao to help root out the so-called black elements for punishment. Tai Shaw, a long-time party member,
in Shanxi province. So I think I got a somewhat unvarnished look at what.
Yeah, thanks for the likes, guys. How are you? My name is Oscar. Yes, Dings. I'm very much okay.
Is one of the poorest areas of China. Back then, people lived in these cave homes, and she lived in a cave home in the back of the house of this elderly man whom I met, Mr. Liu. Mr. Liu told me she had books with him and his light would be on late at night, sometimes reading.
Xi's time in exile has become part of his creation myth. A cave where he lived during his 7 years here is now a tourist attraction. It's filled with books on Marxist philosophy and political theory,
things I'm okay.
which Xi says he read in the evenings while struggling to survive, shaping him into the leader he would become.
插队本身这是一个标志的一个界定的一个阶段。我们感觉呢，到了插队以后，是获得了一个升华、进化。个人呢是确实是一种脱胎换骨的感觉。
Jianying Jia and her family also barely survived Mao. She now lives in New York, the author of 8 books on China, and a contributor to The New Yorker.
I was born into this so-called New China, and I was fed this diet of living in a strong and happy country. And we're going to grow up and, not only build a better China, but at some point we're going to liberate mankind, including the Americans. This was my mother, was myself, and I was 6, and I remember clearly this night where our house was ransacked by these Red Guards. They came at night and our house was turned upside down, my parents were humiliated. You know, you go from the flowers of motherland, mouse children, to suddenly we're black elements.
How many people died as a result of the Cultural Revolution?
There's different estimates of that. Officially, one of the party elders said several millions people died. But, you know, the figures are far from being accurate because the government, whoever was the dominant regime, had always a tendency to cover up.
Between the 1950s and the mid-1970s, China suffered an estimated 25 to 45 million deaths from the famine and from the eradication of black elements.
This is our Holocaust. And to this day, the world has not really come to realize that's really what happened. And the same party responsible for it are still in power, and Mao is still an icon.
Today, Xi Jinping lives and works aside this familiar portrait of Mao overlooking Tiananmen Square in Beijing. Xi has embraced Mao.
It's a mystery why these people don't hate Mao. You know, why don't they reflect why the Cultural Revolution happened, why they would...
Li Yuan, who grew up in China, now writes a column for the New York Times.
Suffering. Xi Jinping himself talked a lot about his suffering when he was a young kid.
He says it was good for him.
Yes, and now he's telling the Chinese young people you should learn to eat bitterness. It will be good for you.
Xi Jinping learned as a teenager that if you want to survive, you have to master the tools of the Maoist toolkit. You have to be redder than anybody else. His education was one of surviving in a highly politicized environment of the Cultural Revolution when his father was one of the antichrists and Xi had to find his way. And to do that, he had to become more politically correct than anybody else. Fundamentally, Xi Jinping drank the Kool-Aid of the Cultural Revolution. And those formative years really did cast the die.
At age 22, Xi Jinping returned from the countryside. He had missed years of schooling, but he would manage to gain entrance to one of China's most elite universities.
Yeah, he was lucky to be accepted into the Tsinghua University. It's China's MIT.
Well, this is a kid who has no secondary education, and he's able to get admitted to the most prestigious university in China.
Yes, very unusual. Mao destroyed the educational system, but then in the early 1970s, Mao decided the educational system had to be reformed, not favoring the elite, but welcome peasants and workers and soldiers as well. And that's how Xi Jinping got admitted.
Xi got a degree in chemical engineering, but his interest was in party politics. In 1979, after graduation, he was posted as a junior aide to a senior Communist Party official. But after 3 years in Beijing, Xi decamped to the provinces to pursue his own political career and would rise through the ranks of local government. It was a time of great reform. died in 1976, and China was now under a new leader, Deng Xiaoping. Twice purged himself, Deng had seen the horrors of the Cultural Revolution. He set out to reverse many of Mao's policies.
The 1980s were an extraordinary decade. Deng Xiaoping was radically changing the relationship of the party to society. He broke up the people's communes, gave peasants property to farm individually, and suddenly we go to the countryside and some of the most amazing open markets where people were selling things they had raised. It was a huge change.
It seemed like China was really different and opening, and it was changing really fast.
Anne Stevenson Yang worked for decades in China as a financial analyst and entrepreneur.
Ever since Deng Xiaoping had told the Politburo that they should change their Mao jackets for sports jackets, every big city built these huge airports, and they had straight avenues straight to these five-star hotels, and these hotels were better than any hotel you'd stay in Europe. And you'd think, what's wrong with China? This is fantastic.
Today, under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping, the attitude toward capitalism is changing, not quickly enough for some members of the new generation who see nothing wrong in mixing Marxism with the market economy. As one China specialist put it, such astounding things have been happening under Deng that no one who works in the China field is willing to make predictions anymore.
In 1979, Deng visited Washington. Deng's opening was seen as a welcome development in the West, and a policy of economic engagement held for the next 4 decades.
Now we share the prospect of a fresh flow of commerce, ideas, and people, which will benefit both our countries.
In China, free trade and foreign investment helped lift millions out of poverty. But many Chinese were not entirely won over, especially students. They were concerned about corruption and wanted democratic reform. In the spring of 1989, pro-democracy demonstrations around the country were gathering momentum. While still a provincial official, Xi Jinping watched carefully.
Xi Jinping tried to gauge the political climate. What's going on? Is the central government supporting this? And being a very cautious bureaucrat, back home, he tried to prevent students from outside to come in and to link up with the local demonstrations.
By early June, the protests boiled over.
At this hour, there are hundreds of thousands of people here in Tiananmen Square.
Observers think the current wave of unrest is the greatest challenge the Communist Party has had to face.
The momentum on Tiananmen Square was strong. For me, the most amazing experience is just hearing people's voice from everywhere.
Zhou Fengshuo was a student leader during the Tiananmen protests. He was among the first to enter the square.
We want to have a dialogue with the communist government, and I think at that time there was a real chance because the party has positioned itself after the Cultural Revolution in the way of open and reform. So you feel like there's freedom in the air on Tiananmen Square.
I was on Tiananmen Square at the night of June 4th. We were all standing like clusters talking to each other, and suddenly there was a guy standing there and he fell backwards and we didn't hear anything. So, were all stunned, and everybody thought, oh, must be rubber bullets. Until we saw that he's now waking up and there's a pool of blood or something from his neck.
Tank rolling in down the main thoroughfare towards the Elephant Square.
As we were kind of retreating, there were, I think, at least a dozen people right around me being shot down.
The sporadic shooting, automatic weapons opened up, people were diving for cover.
That night, it was the worst of China. The monster reared its head.
At one of the big intersections, an APC just ran over a young girl on a bicycle. It was charging down anything and everything, barricades, people, and the protesters had put up the steel barricades and this APC got stuck. And the crowd started gathering around it, hurling insults and rocks and sticks and everything.
天安门的这个就是事件对我最大的震惊上，最大的震惊是军队怎么可以对人民开枪？那是我开始疑问这个国家这个党出了什么问题。
The next day, a man stood in defiance, blocking a column of tanks.
It wasn't just a single tank he stopped. There were 18 tanks and armored carriers in this convoy.
The image of the tank man, as he was called, was carried around the world.
At one point, defiant demonstrators set an ambulance on fire and aimed it at the troops. The vehicle smashed into a traffic island, and that prompted the soldiers to open fire once more on the students.
Just overnight, the optimism that Chinese felt for their own country and for this newly awakened, newly modernizing, newly reforming China came to a very abrupt halt.
David Shambaugh is a professor of U.S.-China relations at George Washington University. He served in the State Department and on the National Security Council during the Carter administration.
I lived in China right after Tiananmen in Beijing. That was severe. This was martial law. The city was occupied by military forces. There were roadblocks everywhere. Foreigners were monitored constantly. Chinese were monitored constantly, interrogated. So that was a really repressive period.
This morning, the government crackdown continues in China, where officials say they have arrested student leaders on their most wanted list. One of those captured, Chauffeur Swap, a 22-year-old physics student. He reportedly was turned in by his sister.
It's been reported that you were turned in by your sister.
That was a government propaganda.
It's not true?
It's not true.
Joe says it was a party tactic to sow distrust among his family. Zhou Fengchuo was fifth on the party's most wanted list and was thrown in prison for a year.
When I was in prison and later for about 5 more years, the support for students even after the massacre was so strong. Like even the policemen